Hi, Steve. We can start.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in the series of Sustainable Futures seminars. This one is presented in association with Creative Manchester. And this afternoon, we've got two speakers. We've got Professor Ricardo Climent, who is Professor of Interactive Music Composition. He's going to be telling us about video games and sustainability. And that talk is in collaboration with Creative Manchester. And we've got Professor Matt Paterson, who is Professor of International Politics at the University of Manchester, and he's going to be talking to us about climate change, Ukraine, and the economy. We're going to have both, after each presentation, we'll have a Q&A, so if you've got any questions for the speakers, do put them in the chat, and we can present them to them during the Q&A. And I think without further ado, we can head on to our first speaker, who is Ricardo.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to share my screen and then you will let me know whether everything looks all right.
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, so I'll start the stopwatch. Thank you for introductions. Thank you to Sustainable Futures for this wonderful series. It's the second time I participate on behalf of our team. The last time it was a very short 5 minutes presentation. Today will be a bit slightly longer, and I hope you enjoy. As Stephen said, I'm Professor of Interactive Music at the University of Manchester. I started to work for the music department in 2006, so it's been quite a while, and I haven't got enough yet, so hopefully more years to come. The subject of the talk today is a UMRI, or Interdisciplinary Research Bomb Priming Competition Fund project called Resourceful World, which is a video game that works as a transformative tool medium to engage people in sustainability research. So we want a young generation of new people to engage with this complexity sometimes found in academic research, and we sort of try to decipher the language and make it more accessible. We'll explain a little bit how it works as we progress. The two people on the team, the startups behind this partnership are two companies. One is Keep It Human, which is the one I founded in 2020, and the other one is part of the music department. And the other one is by my colleague Susanne Embry in computer science called Imago Software. Imago, they hire computer science students to do many different projects, so it's very interesting. Check out on their website in case you want to do something that they can produce for you. So video games by Keep It Human, we got 4 at the minute. The one we started with when we were at the accelerator aspect, now called ARC Accelerator in the UK, was called Timby World as a result of my research on African cultures and an instrument called the Timbila with a wonderful partner, Miquel Bernat, a percussion expert in this instrument as well, where players can actually convert rhythmic energy or tokens into virtual skates that we actually send in the form of a real skateboard to Africa for the charity or NGO Maputo Skate. The next one is Mangrove World in collaboration with Oceanos Conservation, also funded by the University of Manchester School of Arts and faculty, in partnership with Imago Software as well. And we created a video game to create awareness about mangroves reforestation. It's a very important tree that grows along in saline waters around small islands in tropical, and is fundamental for life and economy and so on. So that was a wonderful project we did last year, and we are still continuing with the development. The next one was AI Beatboxer. It was a project that started before COVID, and then it was on hold for a while, and then we retook it last year. And it was premiered at the Manchester Science Festival at the Industry of Science and Museum of Industry, Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, with a total of 22,000 attendees, and it was a wonderful project to showcase for our music department as well. We really much enjoy doing this one. And the current one is Resourceful World, made for Sustainable Futures in collaboration as well with Creative Manchester. And then we'll talk about this a little bit in a second. This presentation will include objectives and the timetable, methodologies, how to translate academic research in the context of video games, game design, engaging young people in sustainability research, doing this, using this kind of medium. Some pre-conclusions on thoughts before the project is finished. But I think it's probably worth exploring or at least discussing prior to the final questions. The mission of this video game is to save the planet. So Resourceful World is a puzzle video game on energies, renewable and non-renewable, exploring their impact on people's health and the environment. So these two words, energies and health combined, are at the key of the academic research we've been exploring. You play as Healthy, our resourceful character, and to save planet's Nimulon, on which indigenous species called the Nimbis depend upon. So planet Nimulon is becoming uninhabitable due to climate change, and then you have Healthy to travel to planets Biomaxa and Galeton to acquire energy superpowers via solving puzzles imaginatively with their sister Nova. So you can right now start making parallels between this wonderful planet and our own planet system, I presume. Let's start with a 90 seconds video clip of the game. So let me see if I can pop up the window here. Then make it full screen. Hope you can see it, and you can hear the sound as well. Back to the presentation. Lovely music by our music composer Benoit Andre and the team. So the objectives and timetable, the first main objective is to build a video game strongly informed by academic research, mostly early career researchers, which will function as a tool for public engagement in sustainability research. The target audience we are looking at is probably between 10 and 25 years old people, so gamers and things like that. We're not 100% sure, but this is more or less the estimated audience. To open new routes of funding to funding strategies as well. For example, we want to build a grant proposal tool that people can use when they apply for large-scale funding, in terms of providing the public engagement tick box, if you wish. And that sometimes is quite problematic for very interesting projects that fail to produce that particular item. UKRI, IQ, some sort of established funding, HRC, also new ones like crowdfunding, in-game macropayments. We want to explore other sources that are connected to the nature of this medium, video gaming. The timetable, we have 5 phases, mostly started with the planning after the funding was awarded in September, the planning, then the pre-production from October to December, with a couple of workshops we had already with academics. Then the production section, which will last until middle of June, where we started with the students and alumni contracts, after long processes, setting up these contracts with HR, fantastic support from the School of Arts and also from computer science to realize these contracts. And then we'll have a workshop number 3 on the 3rd of May with another academic. And then after that, we'll have a few playtests around campus. The next phase will be to do data analysis and our final report and attend a sustainable conference in Colombia. And then we will pre-launch the game probably after that, after attending also a conference in the realm of video gaming. The methodology itself, translating academic research in video games to reach younger audiences. We have started working with academic researchers in 2 main blocks provided by Sustainable Futures. One is resourceful futures, so we work on energies around this concept, and then healthy futures, we focused on health with the questions and the exercises we have prepared for them. Then we did a little bit of further research on the findings, the early findings, especially in terms of the intersections of energy and health, especially energy decisions and how they impact on human health and environmental health. As a result of that, this information very strongly informed the design of the video game, especially the concept art, level design, as well as the narrative, the storytelling, the code mostly. A lot of decisions in code made on this preliminary information, and then the development of the data analysis we are actually working at the minute. So as a result, we also have a secondary row of questions that I started to formulate for our initial academic advisors, and we have a team putting them in some sort of meaningful summary, so that we want to create a full circle, a feedback loop, that we can start again the iteration of the project, to be sure that what we are building is not just a wonderful, beautiful, engaging video game, but also working as expected as a transformative tool for complex academic research that can be more accessible for any audiences. The research aims of the workshops were we're aiming that players will, first of all, understand this academic research, second, empathize with it, and third, earn or gain awareness of it, if not go a step further, which is to change behavior, ideally, but at least earn an understanding, emphasize, and then create awareness of the social cause, in this case, the environmental cause. The academic advisors we were very fortunate to have, they responded to our call for engagement, where Dr. Amanda Lee Langton is a senior lecturer in bioengineering at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change and the Department of Mechanical, Aerospace and Civil Engineering. In the same department, we have Dr. Daniel Wilson, which is also a technician and specialized in advanced manufacturing, with backgrounds also in green technology and environmental sustainability. Then we have Dr. Aristides Vouliotis, an expert in environmental chemistry with particular emphasis on air pollution and atmospheric aerosols. You can imagine he was more into the area of health, impact on health, a lot of very detailed information, as well as a lot of imaginative comments about how to build a game, some of which we're able to implement, others not. Jing Li is a PhD researcher on circular economy with assessing geothermal energy, also at the Tyndall Center. And Dr. Drew Vade, with background in chemistry, using oxidative enzymes or enzymes for the molecular decomposition of plastic wastes. So plastic expert that we were not able to apply directly, but indirectly we got a lot of information very valid from Duhee. Then finally, Dr. Helen Chen division of dentistry in terms of biomaterial sciences. We haven't done this contact yet with this workshop yet, but we're looking forward to it. We tried a couple of times for the several reasons beyond ourselves and our circumstances, including Helen's. We had to postpone it, but now we luckily got a third choice, third option. So the key finding words were a collection of mind maps, notes, video recordings, images taken, and so on. And the key findings, I try to summarize just six of them. We have more of them, but just for you to have a sense of how this has been implemented. So, for example, Amanda and Dan, in the context of sustainable energy in domestic settings, so not industrial ones, but domestic, suggested resource gathering in gameplay. So, coal, collecting coal, for example, and things like that. So these help us to design energy puzzles to collect mineral sources, transport them via a cart, mining cart, take them to the factory, process them to produce electricity, and then store this electricity in the form of a battery. So now we have further big feedback for them. For example, what energies could be more impactful and more profoundly impact and to whom will they impact to? Because we have the possibility to develop all of them, but we want to do maybe two of them and work on the two of them only as a kind of vertical slide of proof of concept. The next one is the impact of choices on decisions and track of change in behavior. That was by Aristides. So that was actually very interesting because it gave us the foundations of the vertical slide, the proof of concept. So we are building two consecutive puzzles. One will be on fossil fuels, and then one on sustainable energies. You've seen some of them already existing in the video, the 90 seconds video. And this will be followed by a third puzzle where decisions will have consequences in terms of pros and cons. So you were to go for fossil fuels, you may advance faster, but in the long run, it will slow you down because your health will deteriorate, the world will become a bit foggy and so on. So the other one will take longer, batteries take longer to recharge with solar panels, but in the long run, it may be a much better solution. Questions we have, for example, now is that we are not 100% sure how to go a step further and say, what's the difference between sustainable energies, sustainable but not clean, clean but not sustainable, in what context we can produce non-sustainable energy, for example, wood, is it renewable? We know forests are not renewable, but maybe there's a good program of reforestation, of program of trees replacement. Is that feasible? Is it not? We want to not to create more complex or confusing narratives as the ones paid by the fossil fuel industry, but actually to clarify, make people aware of the choices and in what moments and parallels we can trace with our existing economy. In terms of plastics, as I said, we don't have this implementation yet, but so we struggle to put that at the minute. But we want to connect them with the additional comments he made, and in particular to follow up with the greenwashing context. This is a very hot topic now, and we don't know yet whether it will be implemented in the future, but we want to follow up this conversation. One of the key findings very quickly, so we got the very strong suggestions to develop the characters, the weather system as well. So some of them have been feasible. For example, the character healthy is pure energy that can be converted into different ones. Others were not so feasible. For example, we were suggested to enter into a microscopic world to create battles between the NIMBYs and small germs, and we couldn't do that. It sounds like a different game. So, but the character transformation into energy sources, what special abilities will make sense. These kind of things we want to follow up the conversation. How to stay warm, fuel poverty was also a very interesting topic that came up. We introduced the concept of survival in the game, and the storyteller very much work around these ideas. So we want to introduce that concept, but we don't know yet what best scenarios could be, whether we can do that now, maybe in a future event or a future level. Biometric materials and dentistry, as I said, we still haven't got that far. We have a follow-up workshop very soon. So in terms of questions emerging from devs, they're not specifically related to the workshop. They were not attending the workshop. They did not exist at the time when the academics were there, but we actually want them to react to the development, which in a way embeds the original workshop. And then they are starting to formulate questions that we are sort of summarizing and putting them in a meaningful way, so that the academics can also help us to progress in the game. For example, Nikita, Tom are working on the riddles for their own puzzle. They want to know what important messages we should get across, for example, when we put the riddles in as part of the game, questions and answers with a multiple choice, for example. In terms of the final part of my presentation, which is the game design, before the conclusions, Resourceful is designed as able to act effectively or imaginatively, especially in difficult situations. That was kind of a background framework for us to sort of start developing many high-level concepts. To explain or give you a screenshot of the team behind this project, which is quite large. I'm not going to name them, but it basically mostly includes existing university students, many of them undergrads. We are targeting people at a very young age because we want to build a game that they actually will love to play, not something that our generation want to think that they would like to play. They actually want them to be involved not only in the discussion but actually in the development. And then we also have the academic advisors and alumni from the Nova Research Center that completed the PhD and now they're back thanks to this project. And then we have the support from Sustainable Futures and Creative Manchester, as I already suggested. The energy puzzles, this is one of them. They're factories that lead to decisions where we have to start thinking hard in terms of these decisions. This is an example of how they look like when we develop them. Okay, I think I want to skip that one. I know actually works. So we have this sort of a handmade sketches that we discuss during the sessions and then that we implement in code when possible. The next one is the vertical slice. As I said, we actually have deciding which ones we are going to build in depth. One is the puzzle on fossil fuels and the other one is on sustainable energies. They will learn the impact on energy decisions on health as a player, and then the decisions puzzles will combine both of them and then we see the pros and cons. At this point, we'll collect data that hopefully will be sent back to academics. So the puzzles will reflect on energy decisions impacting on health. As I say, on NIMBYs, people's health. You can see no hair, you're wearing a gas mask as a result of the actions, and the planet's health, bad actions. So stormy weather and pollution and so on. In terms of power-ups, Healthy will convert herself or theirself into these different superpowers, energies, wind, and they all wind, biofuels, hydrogen and solar. So, and then they will have specific features that they will be able to implement in the game. Same for the bodies, coal, wooden, gas, and petrol. So in terms of our weekly sessions, we work with the students. This is one we had yesterday. We use hybrid modes with some people online, some of us on campus. This is Studio One at Novars. We discuss the puzzles, the narrative. We have questions for academics. We discuss the playtest, and we talk about code up and down, and we use different tools: Discord, Trello, the NAS servers, and so on. See, here we have a little bit of more detail about the subsystems. A lot of them, we are working on them individually. The weather pollution system, the multiplayer system, the platformer system. For example, this is one example of them, the procedural 2.5 LS runner system with custom gravity. It's a planet that you move around, although you always see yourself in front of the screen. And then we spawn dynamically these different assets. This is another one about the different planets and so on. Just to conclude the talk, we have a kind of a 1 minute left, or a little bit more, perhaps. Just some thoughts, preliminary thoughts. People love the resourceful world game art. I think this is something we sort of very proud of. To sort of communicate ideas through design, game design, environmental design, which is a very interesting language, and music design, of course. The character and music are identified as core elements to build empathy within the course. This is extremely important. We want to build an energy, a video game based on empathy. And the data collection will be extremely important as well for academic returns. You're building this for them. They want to have something in return. So they will be acting as a simulator, if you wish. We want to know who is it for, what do we want them to understand, and so on and so forth. And change behavior versus creating awareness. No, so this is more or less what we are after. So it's not just a game. We also want to build a platform that we can continue with. So to integrate all the games in the future, multiplayer social experiences. And I think this is very much everything. Thank you very much. Any questions? I stop sharing the screen now. Let's leave this for the recording, just in case you want to contact any of us.
Thank you, Ricardo. That's really interesting. As a environmentalist and a lifelong gamer, it's definitely good to see that taking place. We do have a few questions in the chat. So Richard asks, what potential is there to work with mainstream games developers to introduce sustainability themes into non-sustainability games such as Grand Theft Auto, etc.? In TV, this approach is called normalizing, i.e. showing characters in TV dramas recycling, using EVs, etc.
I mean, if this game can promote this concept of translating this into a different platform, different medium, or even commercial games, we will be absolutely delighted to do that. We don't want to own this idea. It's something for us to share. I have to say that when we did the spin out with Sustainable Future, with Aspect 2020, one of the case studies, we developed 5 different case studies, one of which went forward, was to actually create this interface to work with existing video games to say, would you implement this concept of responsible, socially responsible awareness kind of thing, sustainable things. And we didn't go further on that for a number of reasons, but it's possible maybe some of the company want to do that. As a small company, we only want to focus on one aspect of it. But for example, our environmental storyteller, Robin Lyons, he actually ran theater plays at the Contact Opera in the past, working on environmental sustainability, and they have a case where audiences can actually decide the end of the play, depending on what happened that evening. This person will go to jail or maybe will be released from. So it's quite interesting, and obviously it can be implemented in many other aspects.
Thanks for that. We've got another couple of questions. You only got a couple of minutes left as well, so let's have to do these. And Adam asks a bit of a gaming question. He asks, are you using any of the existing game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine for the game, and what software is being used for 3D modeling?
Yeah, we use Unreal Engine for this one. Unreal Engine 5 is fantastic, very much a tool that we use for teaching as well at the University of Manchester. People love it. It's not open source, but it's available to everybody, and it's actually open source. Yes, it is. And in the past, for example, Team World, we use Unity, so it's equally good. Different business model. For the 3D development, I think Noelia has been using Maya. I've been using Blender 3D engine. Blender is open source, absolutely wonderful, very much recommended. Yeah.
Great. And I think the last question is from Matt. He asks, I wonder how the game might capture social dynamics, i.e. are the players in the game situated by gender, class, geographical location, etc., or more abstract? And how might it enable an understanding of how social power relations are important to decisions being made?
I mean, this is a very good question, extremely interesting question. We actually thought about this when we developed Team World, because all the people in that planet are actually the same. They look pretty much the same. So when you start thinking about their own personalities, you go, if you wish, beyond what you see. You try to get into the characters' actions. For this particular one, we still haven't developed the multiplayer concept. we got the multiplayer technology already implemented in the game, thanks to Unreal, actually EOS system. But it's something for us to think about. It's extremely important, and if we want to create an effective engine, we actually is creating if you wish, an environment where social beings will talk to each other, will feel together transformation processes, and will engage with probably solving this problem in planet NIMBY, along with the others. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ricardo.
Yeah.
We can move on now to Professor Matt Paterson, whose talk is going to take in climate change, Ukraine, and the economy. So, Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Just let me sort this out. You should be able to see the screen now. Okay, thanks. Thanks all for coming. Yeah, this is a bit like Ricardo's. This is a presentation out of a project internally funded by within Manchester, and this project that started sort of tail end of the summer last year and runs through to this summer. And importantly, I've put on there is James Jackson is the research associate on this project. So quite a lot of the what I will be presenting is being carried out by him, and I want to acknowledge that up front. But essentially, you don't want to move. Okay. Yeah. So this is the project was called Contemporary Crises and Net Zero Transitions: Ukraine, COVID, and Energy. We call it CANUT just because roughly they are things, and it alludes to something hopefully fun. Essentially what we were focused on is the way that there's 4 intertwined crises over the last 3-4 years. One is the COVID lockdowns, one is the COVID recovery, one is the rise in natural gas prices, which has driven a wider inflation across the global economy. And the fourth is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And all of those crises have different sorts of implications for climate policy and climate action. And we wanted to explore not only what's the implication of each one, but how do they interact, given they're all more or less happening at the same time. And so what we've sort of done effectively is map a range of aspects of climate policy action across the period 2018 to 2023. In other words, looking at what was roughly the situation of climate action before these crises hit, and how do they seem to be unfolding at the moment. And so the questions then are sort of, have these crises strengthened or weakened action? What particular aspects of climate action are most affected by them? And what are the mechanisms and dynamics that are driving these effects? And sort of you may have come across the phrase the polycrisis that seems to be gaining in currency and usage. And so that's trying to capture in some way the question of interactions between these crises, right? The COVID might have one dynamic, the Ukraine crisis might have a different, but together they produce some other type of effect. And part of the reason for focusing in on these questions of crises is that they all have economic dimensions, and the general story and analyses of environmental policy and politics for much of the last 50 years has been to assume that economic crises produce retrenchments of environmental policy. That is to say, when we go into a sort of recession or something, policymakers start to say, oh, well, we need to choose between the economy and the environment, and we can't afford the costs of environmental action at this point in time, right? So we saw that in 1973-4 with the oil crisis. We saw it in 1979-80 with a big recession there across the Western world. And we saw it in the global financial crisis. A bit more complicated, I think, already in the global financial crisis of 2007-11, where there was some element of people using that crisis to try and accelerate action on climate change specifically, but also other aspects of environmental policy. So we wanted to see, has this dynamic been repeated in these crises? Almost, I think we had a hunch that probably it wouldn't, right? That there would be something different going on. I think that's what we've found. So what we've done, the main core of the project has been hiring a research associate, Dr. James Jackson, who had just finished his PhD at Sheffield, and has been working really, really brilliantly on this project to collect and put together data and help us think through the impacts of this. And then it's been that's been combined with a broad team of about 30 people from University of Manchester, Melbourne, and Toronto, sort of key partners for the University of Manchester in general. So part of the funding was given because of that international dynamic. And that's quite a highly interdisciplinary mix. Political scientists, policy scholars are dominant within that, but to inform the work, but there's also people from Tyndall Centre, for example, at Manchester, more people on the technical side, geographers, a range of people from different disciplines involved. And we're now starting to think about outputs and what we will do beyond the life of this to probably try and secure some external funding to carry on this work. And we decided to focus on impacts on 6 countries, partly for manageability reasons, because we were quite, as you'll see, we're trying to collect quite a lot of data, so we needed to limit the countries. UK, Canada, and Australia, because that's where the team's based. But also we looked at Japan, Germany, and India, mostly because we thought they would tell us different things about the impacts of the different crises. So, for example, Germany is particularly affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine because of its dependence on natural gas imports from Russia. And what we've done is we've collected a whole load of quantitative macroeconomic data from the IMF, from the World Bank, from the World Trade Organization, to be able to have this sort of big picture comparison across these 6 countries. And secondly, a whole load of qualitative document analysis from the countries to sort of really dig into what's driving what has changed in climate policy over that 5-year period, 5-6-year period in response to these crises. And so we've collected 4 main types of data for this time period. The biggest issue to note about this data is that a lot of it, especially on the macroeconomic side, is never fully up to date, never as up to date as you want it to be. So for 2023, we still only have sort of fragmentary data, and therefore, and even back into some bits of 2022, so that effects of the Ukraine crisis is where we have the weakest evidence so far. But nevertheless, I think we've got to a position where we feel reasonably comfortable with saying things about what's been going on there. So we've collected a whole load of data for the background macroeconomic data, the trade flows. So, for example, how are trade flows? How is trade being disrupted? For example, in natural gas or in the grain not getting out of Ukraine, or a range of other things. We'll come to a couple of examples of that later on. In state finances, so are state budgets being affected by the economic crisis and therefore their ability to spend on climate action? The trends in the GHG emissions themselves, which are fairly easy to track. There's lots of data sets doing that. And then what we then did was what we then looked at is, actually, I'm going to go to the end, the other end now, and come to the middle and the end. Then at the output end, if you like, we've looked at the overall changing climate policy action in 2 different ways. One is to look at legislation and new policies. What have countries done? Have they developed more new forms of climate policy? Are there bits of climate policy they've abandoned? And so on. And the second is we've looked at budget data. So how much of the spending on these climate policy initiatives? As we will know, any of us in the UK will know that the government is very good at flashy announcements with several £billion attached to X program. It's not always obvious that money actually gets spent or gets spent usefully. So, but generally is spending going up or down on climate related initiatives. And then in between that, what we're really trying to get to, and we've collected a lot of, is the sort of narratives that policymakers come up with, right? So how do they, if, for example, they introduce a new program for heat pumps in housing, which has been the case in several of these countries, how do they explain the rationale for that? Do they say, well, we need to accelerate weaning ourselves off natural gas because of our vulnerabilities, the energy security questions? How do they frame it, if you like? And that's a way of tracking back from the broad macroeconomic shifts produced by these crises to whether or not climate change action is affected by them and how it's affected by them. Now my screen doesn't seem to want to move. So what have we found overall at the moment? This may be a surprise to some people. It was sort of a semi-surprise to us, I think, but not totally, is that we definitely don't find any overall evidence of large-scale backtracking on climate action, right? We can think of all sorts of specific examples. So, for example, the one a couple of weeks ago that most of us in the climate world rolled our eyes about was the UK lowering taxes on domestic aviation, which is absolutely the wrong thing. They should not have done that. But that, you know, so we can think of examples of that, or under the Liz Truss government, the effort to bring back fracking. But overall, when you look at it in the round, you can't say that the climate policy sort of environment has backtracked on climate policy during and after these crises. And if anything, we would claim that you can see a modest increase in climate ambition across most of these countries, with Japan being the major exception. And we can see that measured by a number of things: increase in the number of ambition and climate policies. So, for example, on average across these 6 countries, what we might call the density of climate policy has increased, with an average of 3 to 4 new climate related policies introduced per year across these countries. And in general, when you look qualitatively at those seem to be mostly enhancing ambition compared to what was there before. We can also see increases in budgets for climate initiatives. As a percentage of GDP, this has risen by about 3 to 10% across these cases during this time period. Again, sometimes measuring that involves a certain amount of judgment, but that's our view on what that data tells us. And so both policy density and intensity, 2 different ways of thinking about how policies change in a particular area, have increased across these countries, with this sort of major exception being Japan. And so each of these countries pretty much each of these countries has introduced some sort of major headline climate policy during this snapshot. The Energy Security Act in the UK, and before that, the Green Industrial Revolution Strategy, the Emissions Reduction Act in Canada, the Climate Change Act in Australia, India's 2022 budget, which was really climate focused, and Germany's Easter package budget from earlier this year, which targeted large amounts of money for climate-related actions. None of this should be taken to mean that their climate policy is on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement or the scale of the climate challenge. That's absolutely not the case, but that was not the case before. We're talking about a modest increase in ambition. It might mean that one or 2 of these countries are slightly closer to getting to being on track for their Paris Agreement targets, but it's not. It's too early to say whether that's the case or not. And the biggest countervailing dynamic that we see is in increases in fossil fuel subsidies. New oil and gas licenses in the UK, for example, and in Canada, especially in Alberta. Modest returns to coal in Germany because they're trying to win because of the effects of reduced supply of natural gas from Russia, and rollbacks on nuclear phase outs in Germany and Japan. So those are the sort of biggest things that go in the slightly opposite direction, although obviously the nuclear point is a bit ambiguous in relation to climate policy, depending on your point of view about nuclear. So how do we explain this effect? And this is sort of where one of the arguments of an article that we're now going to start developing over the next couple of months. And one of the things that we've sort of come up with as an idea, this is out the brainstorming with our colleagues in Melbourne and Toronto, as well as ourselves, is to think of a logic of disentangling, right? That these particular crises have generated incentives for policymakers to try and disentangle themselves and their economies from a range of global economic processes. And this is specifically mostly about vulnerabilities to supply chain disruption. So with the COVID lockdowns, and then even with a longer effect going into the period of sort of opening up, but nevertheless in a fairly faltering way, what that really revealed was China's centrality to a whole series of global manufacturing supply chains, including, of course, ones that are really, really important to the clean energy transition, solar panel manufacture, for example. And in the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine's centrality to grain, oil, semiconductor components, but also to one or two natural resources. It's a biggish player, for example, in titanium mining, which is also important to renewable energy generation technologies. And of course, the Russian importance to gas markets, especially in Europe. So disentangling and reducing dependence to the volatility produced by those two crises has been a driver of policy responses, and we call this a form of disentangling. This also then interacts with a pre-existing shift in policy in how governments are pursuing climate policy through a shift towards industrial strategies. Right, so rather than this is slightly crude, but if you go through to the early 2010s, the really dominant policy strategy was to use market mechanism instruments, emissions trading, for example, to drive down emissions with mixed effects at best. And what's happened since the mid 2010s is that Western companies have joined countries like China and Korea, which have always oriented this into a much more active attempt to shift economies to develop new industries. If you remember, the UK shifted the name of its climate ministry. It put climate policy into a new ministry called Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, which is a good signal of when and how that was doing. So this trend was already in place, and the crisis really intensified this. I've just realised I'm running out of time, so I will accelerate this last bit. So in the US, we've got the IRA, or the Industrial Recovery Act, I think it's called, but similar ones going on in Europe, Britain, and our countries we've looked at. And so climate policy then has been central to this shift of industrial strategy. It's one of the reasons governments have gone down that route. And it's really important to securing domestic legitimacy of shifts to renewables because it brings jobs and so on. And the crises, because they wanted countries to sort of disentangle from these supply chain problems, have intensified that logic. India's role as the president of the G20 at the moment, and Japan's at the G7, are actually really important to that shift across a range of major economies. So these logics play out slightly different in each country. Australia, for example, has been forced to disentangle somewhat from some of its carbon exports to capitalize on its natural resources, but some of it's seeking new markets in green energy through nickel and lithium exports, for example, central to renewable energy technologies. Canada has got, on the one hand, incentives to try and replace to fill the void in natural gas supply, but it's actually it's difficult for it to do that, and it's sort of not gone down that direction as much as we want. In Germany, there's a very clear effort to reduce dependence on Russian gas and install and they're now framing explicitly green renewable energy technologies as freedom fuels. India seeking to disentangle itself generally from dependency on global north industries and develop its own manufacturing basis in wind and solar. Japan increasingly in a situation where it's quite vulnerable because China dominates Asian energy markets so much, and the UK seeking to disentangle from natural gas dependence to gain energy sovereignty, and renewable energies are important to that. Again, there's countervailing things to all of these, but disentangling is driving a lot of these policy shifts. And so, and again, I come back to the previous point. So we see as a bunch of effects of that, the onshoring of manufacturing for electric vehicles, for batteries, for solar PV, and for wind turbines in many of these countries, as well as elsewhere, like in the United States, and accelerating transitions away from natural gas towards heat pumps, electrification of domestic heating via heat pumps, and accelerated electrification of transport. But it also generates the same logic of disentangling, generates new pressures for domestic oil and gas production to displace Russian production. So I will cease that there because I'm aware I've run out of time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Matt. Really interesting research. That's tackling some really big issues, it's fair to say. Yep, in terms of questions, First one we've got is, what about other countries beyond your six? And is there any evidence that there are similar patterns elsewhere?
Okay, I don't know why I don't see the chat question, so you'll just have to say they're not appearing in my chat for some reason. Anyway, well, look, the most obvious point is about the United States. The I think it's called the Industrial Recovery Act. It's become known as the IRA, which is a slightly odd thing to call things in a British context, but that actually had demonstrable effects. I've seen stuff already. We haven't tracked it ourselves, but the other people have been tracking already increases in investment in solar manufacturing, in a range of other, and battery assembly and manufacture and so on, and resource, and at the resource end, right, searching for lithium and new sources of cobalt and the minerals that are central to these transitions. So all the way back along the supply chain. We see that in the US as well, at the European level, as well as within Germany specifically. You see a number of policies going in a similar direction. So I think we're not going to be in a position to do the same level of detail, but I think we can sort of say that the countries that we've looked at are part of a bigger pattern. You're muted at the moment, Steve.
Right, sorry, I still haven't learned after all these years. Second question is, why is there a surprise that countries would be seeking to wean themselves off of fossil fuels?
That's a good. I mean, it's very clearly long been the case that pretty much every country on the planet, partial exception of Bhutan, I would say, has assumed, and all the major global agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, have an assumption that I think has been really heavily installed for 70, 80 years, at least since the Second World War, that economic growth and fossil energy consumption more or less go hand in hand, right? So that if you want to promote the economy, then you have to invest in energy. For a long time, the World Bank was that was a central part of their strategy, because they were funding coal plants. They were funding other big energy infrastructure like hydro, especially built a lot of dams, famously, or Aswan Dam or the big one in Ghana and so on. But coal extraction, oil and gas extraction, and refining and manufacturing and generating electricity from has been a central development strategy in both global north and global south. It's not a north-south issue really. And the industries, therefore, that are associated with that, which is not just the energy companies themselves, the oil and gas companies, the coal companies, the electricity generators, but also the sort of allied, right, the car manufacturers, the steel manufacturers, all of the people who are large energy consumers. They have business models, large amounts of sunk investments into a fossil energy centered system. So it's colossal amounts of money that are therefore invested in that. And those companies are also highly powerful, right? So they've had long capacity to block action, and have used that. Right? It's a big part of the general explanation for why we have really poor response to climate change so far compared to the scale of the challenge, is because of the power of those companies to lobby governments to prevent threats to their interests. And so that's, I think, the core of the explanation for why you would expect that when times get really tough, like when the economy is going reasonably well, those companies will be able to be a bit more relaxed about, you know, governments giving money for energy efficiency measures, or a feed-in tariff for people putting solar on their roofs. But when you get into a crisis, then they lobby furiously. And I think that's the reason why in most crises that's the case. And governments have internalized an assumption that economic growth and energy consumption increases go hand in hand, so that when you're in a recession, you need to promote energy and not create constraints on energy use, because you need that investment to drive the recovery from the recession. The shift, I think, is over the last 15 years. So you do see bits of it in the last financial crisis, where it becomes less obvious that all policymakers internalize that. some of the corporate blocks also had shifted. Like the car manufacturers by 2009 are much less closely tied to the oil companies than they were. They're already developing hybrids. Some of them are already thinking about fuel cells or electric vehicles as alternatives to internal combustion engine. So the lobbying is less strong than it was in previous crises. And the sort of assumption that that energy has to come from fossil fuels had started to weaken. And I think we see much more of that now. And also one of the things you get is that reasonably powerful acts. I didn't mention this in the presentation. I think it was on one of the slides, this term fossilflation. I'm forgetting the name. James will remember the name, but one of the members of the board of the European Central Bank wrote quite an interesting paper in early 2023. Hang on, no, where are we? Early 2022, about this time last year, in response to the and she coined the phrase fossilflation, to specifically say that actually the inflation, we have to name it as being driven by fossil fuel price rises. So one of the reasons we're now in that crisis and the whole cost of living crisis is driven by our dependence on fossil fuels. So I think that's been another thing that shifted the sort of storylines and it's harder then for people to sit there and say, you know what, we need more of this stuff. Actually, when it's, everybody knows now that on electricity generation, solar and wind, even in a country like Britain, solar is cheaper than natural gas. So that bit of the pic, whereas always there was assumption that renewable energy was more expensive, and that's very clearly no longer true.
Thanks for that. And I think probably the final question is from Gabor in the chat. About 2 years ago, the EU has set up a taxonomy for energy, defining what energy sources should be considered sustainable. Do you think this might change as a consequence of the various recent developments, such as war in Ukraine, Russia losing its status as an energy supplier, etc.?
Short answer is I have no idea. James, I don't know if you do either, but so I'll have a quick speculation. I doubt it would. There was quite a lot of controversy over that. I wouldn't follow it in detail, but I remember seeing controversy over the designation of certain things that people were lobbying to get included as sustainable, nuclear in particular, but also biofuels, controversies over that. I can imagine it strengthens the hand of the biofuels lobby, for example, to say, look, we're a way that but biofuels mostly, biofuels that's methane from landfill, for example, feeding into a natural gas system, that's, it doesn't follow that it's sustainable in any meaningful sense, but you can imagine how it would be easier to try and sell investment in that, capturing methane from landfill to use in the natural gas system. The countries are already doing a fair bit of that, as I understand anyway, variably in different countries. James, I don't know if you have any additions on that, because you might be more on top of the EU bit than me.
Yeah, like Matt says, I think the original EU taxonomy, that were by no means the first country to introduce one, was quite contested when it was implemented for what it actually included as green and not green. The only thing I can imagine it might change now is with the European Net Zero Industry Act, or their Green Industrial Plan. They might try and complement it, so what specific fuels they're actually interested in, and trying to sort of prohibit fuels that aren't in their best interest, because they do seem to be having an increasingly tense relationship with the US, who are in turn having an increasingly tense relationship with China. But that is the only way at the moment I could foresee the taxonomic framework probably changing in the immediate term.
I think it would be useful. It would be easy enough to imagine the ways that those debates will play out as a logic of as a function of that disentangling logic, right? So let's say which of these fuels that James just alluded to are going to help us become more energy self-sufficient and less reliant on volatile international supplies.
Thanks for that. And I suppose that brings us back to the end. So thanks everyone for attending, and thank you especially to our two speakers. Really, really interesting and diverse talks. We'll follow up with an email with the recording of this, and I think we can get the slides out as well. And stay tuned for the next one, I guess. So follow us on the. In fact, the link is in the chat there. and follow us on Twitter and the usual places. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.